What is an irregular warfare conference without a Wild Bill Donovan quote? Wild Bill said, strategy without information upon which it can rely is useless unless it is intelligently directed to the strategic purpose. Another OSS alum, Alan Dulles, fresh off a assignment as a Swiss director at OSS, testified to the Senate in 1947 that 80% of all intelligence is what guides our national policy. I would argue that that is more today, more like 90, maybe more, I don't know. 90% of publicly available information makes up intelligence. With more than 400 terabytes of data or information that's public every single day, we have to leverage this capability to uncover hidden links, connections, develop patterns of life, enforce sanctions, or uncover illicit financial transactions like Quantifind does, or illuminate compromised devices or credentials like SpyCloud. And so if I didn't say before, this is the Adversary Networks and Open Source Intelligence panel, and here we go. All right, for our panelists here, we have Dr. Ryan Berg, Director of the Americas Program and Head of Future Venezuela Initiative for the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Thanks very much, David.
All right. Dr. John Stockton, co-founded Quantifind in 2009 and now leads Quantifind's prototyping efforts to extract signals and values from the vast amounts of diverse, unstructured data. I'm just going to read one more sentence so everyone knows John might be the smartest guy in the room. John's prior academic work included theoretical and experimental research in precision metrology. I had to look that up. Quantum entanglement and atomic physics. And Phil Fuster is a seasoned cybersecurity and growth executive with more than 35 years experience leading strategic sales efforts across the private and public sectors. He's vice president of government sales at SpyCloud.
Thank you.
All right. We're going for it, guys. Dr. Berg, you wrote a recent foreign policy article that highlighted the Trump administration's heavy focus on the Western Hemisphere and Secretary Rubio and other cabinet-level officials as one of their first visits to South America. You said it put China on their back foot in the region, at least temporarily. You go on to say the administration scrutinized countries' relations with China with a renewed focus. One of the things the U.S. will have to do to beat China is private sector engagement, which we've talked about most of the day. I think of the first Trump administration and Keith Kroc, who is Department of State's Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at the time. He created a framework and set principles to beat China's 5G Huawei push in Europe. What would a framework like that in Latin America look like, and what is the role of publicly available information and OSINT play?
Great. Thanks very much for the question, David. And thanks to my fellow panelists for being here, and to all of you. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the room, folks CSIS has worked with over the years on a number of different initiatives. So I think as Latin Americanists, I'll speak from the Latin America scholar perspective, knowing a lot of folks who look at our region and study our region. We haven't really had the conversation from the policy community's perspective in terms of which areas we want to compete in. And this has been a great frustration to me. The competitive juices are flowing. Clearly the Trump administration wants to be more assertive in the region. For the first time in my lifetime, and perhaps the only time in my lifetime, there's a State Department that's run by a number one and a number two who are both Latin Americanists. I don't expect to see that again in my lifetime. So we have a unique constellation of individuals in important positions. Up to day 101, we had Mike Waltz, the NSA position. Also very interested in Latin America, we had a high-level special envoy who used to be the head of the Inter-American Development Bank and formerly the National Security Council lead for Western Hemisphere in the Trump 1.0. So there were a lot of folks in and around important Trump circles who are pushing Latin America. And I think it's fair to say that this administration, in many ways, is a Latin America first administration. So by extension, when it says that this should be the golden age of the Americas, I think what the Trump folks mean, and in fact, Secretary of State Marco Rubio wrote this in his first op-ed before his first trip to Panama, that by extension means Americas first, and a golden age of the Americas. So the U.S. can't be prosperous unless its immediate and shared neighborhood is also safe, prosperous, economically integrated, and so on. Now, when it comes to the private sector competition piece with China, that's one of the main parts of this broader strategy where I think we've been lacking in terms of this conversation. We haven't yet had the policy conversation that we need to in our community to answer the question that I think is very important: which 3 to 5 sectors are the most important sectors where you want to compete, right? We talk about all the cool stuff that we do. We've got the best AI, we've got the best cloud computing, we've got great ICT infrastructure and so on. But we haven't yet kind of outlined those areas where we know we have comparative advantage and where we can bring tools to bear to actually compete with the Chinese. And I would argue if you don't pick your sort of 3 to 5 priority areas, you're not really competing, right? And I think the Chinese have done this. There was an important paper in 2020 that was published where they basically laid out what they call the ABCs of competition in the next round of competition with the U.S. The Chinese are focused on what they call new infrastructure. So I understand a lot of folks in the room get kind of spun up about Changsha opening in November of last year, or these other big infrastructure projects, a bioceanic railway corridor and so on. Yes, these are important, but in many ways these deals have been signed years ago and there's a lag time and we're only seeing them manifest themselves now. What the Chinese are approaching now, however, is what they call the new infrastructure. And they say in this paper that I mentioned, go through your ABCs. So for every letter of the alphabet, they've got a sector in which they want to compete. Most of them, when you check the ABCs, are sectors in which we lead or we at least have parity. And they're the things that we're here talking about today: cloud computing, AI, big data, these kinds of things. And the Chinese strategy overall, I think, is very simple. They saw how the United States came to economic dominance, and they're simply copying it and trying to do it better. If they can get most of the global south, which includes Latin America, Africa, and much of Southeast Asia, partnered mostly with them or in a position where they prefer to partner with China on these important sectors that both countries, the Chinese and the United States, have good reason to believe dominance over will allow you to write the next rules of the economic governance playbook, then of course China's going to go for the most number of countries that want to side with it. And Latin America is a key piece of that broader, grander strategic play. So a little bit of self-criticism for our community in that we haven't yet had that conversation, but I think we absolutely need to if we're going to have a strategy for economic competition that brings in the private sector as a key partner.
So if we were going to, if we're going to partner in the way that we need to, in order to essentially edge China out, how can the private sector either help augment or illuminate nefarious networks, or at least even just tell partners that, hey, don't buy Chinese goods, don't go this route?
Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah, and thank you for having me, David. This is going to be great. So I also agree that we need to focus, right? Like if you haven't picked your sectors, then you're boiling the ocean. It's too much, and that's especially true for what I'm going to add to the conversation, which is building that map. If we're going to engage, which I also agree with, into the private sector heavily as a competitive advantage, you need to know that intimately via OSINT, right? And so what we do as a company is take all the publicly available information, commercially available information, use AI to do all the entity resolution, relationship extraction, risk labeling, and build a knowledge graph, which basically serves as kind of a two-way map, which establishes trust, right? And so who are we going to lean in on and invest in and not? It's basically in AI, there's this alignment problem, right, with AI, but there's also the global kind of alignment problem between our private sectors and our public sectors. And if you don't have the intelligence from the OSINT to map that very granularly to know where everyone is, not only where they're connected to foreign entities and have signals of risk, whether it's sanctions or money laundering, and we do a bit of all that with banks, for example. Signals like no-go signals, basically. You need to know how each of your potential partners are incentivized, and OSINT's a great way to do that. And so building a knowledge graph really that lets you look both ways and cover all the defensive use cases that the earlier teams did a great job on summarizing for the bank anti-money laundering, CFIUS, et cetera, all the things you're doing from a defensive perspective, but you can also play offense. And the only counter I would give to the private sector argument is we need to help the public sector, as the general earlier and others have said, using OSINT as a resource to do diplomacy, right? So, intelligence-based diplomacy, OSINT diplomacy, and we've been doing that effectively in AFRICOM and analogs to South America and the global south, where, even if you're just helping them with the illegal fishing problem, the illegal wildlife problem, illegal mining, all the resource exploitation, and not saying China bad, but you're getting exploited, and we want to lift you up to make you independent and, teach you how to, to use the bad analogy, teach you how to fish, not give you the fish, then that's a better sales pitch, because it's a data-driven sales pitch you're giving, and OSINT helps you do that well.
Yeah, if I can add, OSINT can be used to help augment intelligence on in the public sector side. Simple things like looking at credential monitoring and looking for compromised government infrastructure, looking at telco compromised infrastructure, private sector compromised infrastructure. OSINT like that can help detect where the PRC is having influence, looking at malware log analysis, looking at darknet monitoring and attribution support. Those things are huge in being able to see where money laundering, where tariff avoidance can be occurring, et cetera, right? Where the Chinese are influencing different governments across Latin America.
Yeah, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the cyber intrusion, sort of poking around in the cyberspace, is actually a first indicator in, more actions by China. Is that right? Is that what you've seen? All right. All right. Next question.
Can I just add one more thing, David? So we're talking about OSINT here on this panel. I think it's important to connect the fact that we're talking about open source intel stuff that's out there for everybody to see, but might not be concentrated in one spot, put together as a neat package with a message and a digestible set of conclusions. That's really important. It's really important to note that we're mostly talking about a region of democracies. So if we want to create action in Latin America, OSINT is a great way to galvanize or to catalyze anger or awareness of a certain issue or movement for political action, whatever it might be, in our competition with the PRC, because we're mostly dealing with governments that need to be responsive to the zeitgeist on the street or in the halls of power and so on. And then the fact that we're talking about OSINT, I think, makes it easier to push for change in these kinds of countries, because we're not talking about revealing classified information here, right? We're talking about just being able to use tools like these gentlemen have to pull together stuff that's out there, but not concentrated and put together in a digestible product.
Yeah, and if I could add one more thing, just while we were here looking at the PRC's influence in space in Latin America or in Argentina, one of our investigators found, 2 compromised machines in 2 different countries that had infected systems, right, that were in organizations that are providing space influence in Latin America, like that, today, in our records. And it was just funny. We just wanted to search through the data based on a question that was asked earlier, and that quickly we found that information. So OSINT can augment, the intelligence that, our government can use to influence what's going on down there or understand what's going on down there very quickly.
Yeah, just to add to the OSINT point, why it's so critical is because it is open. You can basically deputize the rest of, the whole of society in the fight, not just companies like ours, but NGOs and anyone else. And it's safe, right? It's shareable. It's open. If you don't take advantage of that and share that value, then it's an own goal, right? Also, the problems it's helping you address are also safe and kind of non-controversial, like the illegal fishing problem. Everyone agrees it's a problem, right? It's not anything that's very particular to the U.S. It's more particular to the partner nations. So it's a huge opportunity just to get that force multiplier from whole of society.
Yeah, great points. Okay, economic statecraft. It's all the rage. You saw the panel earlier. China's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. China has shown its ability to influence nation states through coercive capital and the Belt and Road Initiative, which it now includes some parts of South America. Tariffs are going to be a point of friction. And in a most recent blog by Quantifind, you stated that tariffs should be treated like sanctions and money laundering. OSINT has provided giant windfalls in this arena, and the addition of commercially available information, which is data that can be bought from companies that includes satellite imagery, location data, into sort of the ODNI's umbrella of publicly available information, opens up a lot of opportunities, frankly, for the public and private sector. So how should we approach that from both a governmental standpoint and what is, I'm going to keep harping on this, but what is the role of the private sector in this? And then just if you could add, how do we mitigate the risk or augment U.S. Government or partner nation efforts to stop it?
Yeah, I'll take it first. First of all, naming and shaming doesn't work because, like, the other side doesn't have shame, doesn't work. You need to have teeth. If you don't have teeth, then nobody cares, right? So, and the thing people don't realize, the earlier panelists did a great job educating, but the money laundering, the anti-money laundering apparatus as it exists regulation-wise in the U.S. is very strong, and it has deputized all the banks into the intelligence fight to fight that problem, right? And there's a strong ecosystem supported by other companies like ours. And that's huge. You would want to make the analogy to tariffs. Several things would help with that. One is, obviously with kind of let's call them dynamic policy changes, like technology needs to be able to quickly adjust to whenever policy changes. So like that's one kind of requirement on our side. But I think the key word is ownership, right? Like who owns the regulation? Who are the regulated? Like importers, exporters, and I know there are policies that exist today in CBP and importers, et cetera, but it's not at the same level of maturity as the anti-money laundering, which could be a goal and could be a model, even though they definitely get some things wrong too. There's also ownership of the OSINT football that was mentioned earlier, right? Which is a challenging factor in this whole thing. And then there's just straight ownership. Like the whole goal of this with tariffs and with money laundering and sanctions is evasion, right? Like there's shelf companies, shell companies, fronts, et cetera. And if you don't have the knowledge graph to be able to find ultimate beneficial owners, then you're blind. So you need to have all those elements, and then these kind of companies can help.
Yeah, our identity intelligence capabilities can address China's coercive economic influence, especially in Latin America. It really requires a proactive, data-driven approach to shine a light on what they're doing in Latin America and disrupt that hidden financial and technological influence that is going on. The government agencies need to be able to leverage OSINT and commercially available intelligence to map the networks of compromised digital identities, monitor the breach exposure to key infrastructure and commerce stakeholders, and correlate that with the suspicious trade activities, especially around tariffs. That's where you have gray zone and supply chain, and one of the things we can do is really rate that supply chain to show kind of where the high risk is, and that's some of the information I think the government needs to see, because that's always a big problem when you're deciding what governments you work with and who you can work with in those countries.
Nothing much to add other than I'm very excited about what some of these guys are working on, especially with banking. and financial flows, because we spend a lot of time studying authoritarian regimes at CSIS, and these are all criminal regimes at the same time. They don't survive without their criminal networks. There's an authoritarian corruption nexus with all of them: Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. And finding where the money is of course key to being able to put some modicum of pressure on these regimes to either change or, ojalá, eventually to fall.
Yeah, so just before we get to the next question, back to Dr. Stockton about who owns regulations. So my next question is about foreign terrorist organizations and the Trump administration labeling 8 drug cartels as FTOs. The regulations for money laundering and holding money of designated FTOs is already there. Now, if we're talking about cartels, that money is ubiquitous in U.S. banks. So the regulations are there, and they're owned by, I don't know who owns. I'm not an expert in banking, but
It's like FinCEN, OCC, all the regulators who make sure of it.
Right. Yeah. Treasury. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Just blanked there for a second. Okay. So working through this, the regulations are there. We know who owns it, but this is a system that's been in place for a long time, and there's dirty money. So now we're going to go after it. And then a follow-up question for Dr. Berg, because I read that China now has essentially its version of the Hawala system and laundering money in South America primarily for cartels. So what do we do? How do we do this?
Yeah, so I'm not going to add much to what you said, but basically it's great that we have a wedge, right? And it's just like we're deputizing all of society. We can deputize existing regulation, just squeeze it in. I don't think it's a stretch to call the cartels, FTOs. And also, by way of kind of criminal convergence, they have lots of the same techniques, lots of the same money. So like you can not just leverage the same regulations, but the same typologies, right? And look for the same patterns while you're trying to suss them out. You need to make sure you have the right data to do it well. That's, once you get the regulation block out of the way, it's okay, let's do it well. And so then you need unstructured data, you need shipment data, you're not going to get there. And often it's hard, but to the point others have made today, like criminals can't hide in the dark forever. They have to launder from the dark realm to the light realm, and that's where you get them, right? That's where you need to look at that nexus and suss it out. So yeah, I'll stop there.
So you hit the nail on the head, David. The Chinese criminal organizations have become, according to some of the best reports I've seen, including one from Mr. Leland Lazarus, who was on one of the previous panels here, some of the best money laundering organizations operating in Latin America on behalf of some of the biggest cartels, Sinaloa, Jalisco, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're doing it through Chinese diaspora networks, through bank accounts that stretch from the region back to the mainland. They're doing it in ways where sometimes money doesn't even physically move. And they're doing it in a way that actually doesn't charge the group in need of money laundering as much of a fee as traditional money laundering organizations. And so they've operated in a traditional cutthroat Chinese fashion, pushing a lot of traditional money launderers out of the business. And these new methods have actually created a big challenge for those who are used to going after traditional forms of money laundering, having, of course, to catch up to some of these organizations. I would argue from the strategic perspective, just to step back for a second, it creates even more headaches for us, because at the same time as we're trying to compete state to state with the PRC in a region like Latin America, you also then have your adversary either tacitly allowing money laundering to happen or actively involved in it. And I leave that question open to folks smarter than I am in the room as to how involved the PRC is in some of these activities versus just tacitly allowing it to take place. But either way, you have some form of involvement on top of the strategic layer. It complicates the picture in the region even more.
Yeah, the cartels are operating in a very sophisticated way, right? The money laundering is being done through stolen credentials, through crypto, and that money is going, across, being used by Chinese criminal organizations, and raw material for drugs are being sent back. You know, the ability to look at that financial flow is critical to understanding, you know, what's going on, how much of that is nation state, and a lot of that can be looked at from an OSINT perspective, tying those identities back together. You could also look at, you know, who's acting as proxies for those cartels in that OSINT. Because, again, those criminals that are doing that work today may have been doing sextortion on another day, or may have been doing different cyber crimes. So they all tie back together, and they all leave digital dust that you can find out there.
I'll tell you a quick story that will help you out, SpyCloud. When I was an OCenter, we didn't have identity intelligence, or it wasn't that big. But you have to remember that there's always a person behind the keyboard, and people are, you know, prone to habit. So identity intelligence, we found a password, and we searched against a unique password and found a plethora of personas that you would not find. Come to find out, this person was just using this very same, very unique password for multiple accounts, and they were doing all kinds of bad stuff. But
the new AI engine that we just we're about to turn on will give you all the variations of that password. Will give you the different personas that those individuals may be using in an initial analysis, so that your analysts and your cyber hunters from either a defensive or offensive capability can find that individual much faster.
whoa, Phil, save it for tomorrow, man. You gotta. Whew. All right,
Once you know that individual, you could use us now.
we're all gonna be partners by the end of the day. All right. Okay. Like I said, the Trump administration labeled 8 drug cartels as FTOs earlier this year. So this opens up a whole new swath of authorities for the DoD to go after cartels if we want, and obviously for FinCEN and FATF to go after the money. How are the capabilities that you offer? How can they help in that effort? And then to Dr. Berg, what kinds of blowback do you see using all these new authorities? I shouldn't say new authorities. You know what I mean? New targets.
Yeah, at the root of cybercrime, as he has said, there's always a human actor, right? And humans are prone to making mistakes. They leave that cyber dust. They reuse passwords. They self-infect with malware, exposing themselves out there. So our, rich recaptured identity intelligence provides really deep visibility into that digital dust, and it looks at the criminal underground. Our labs folks do a really good job at acting like the bad actors out there and getting that information. And by ingesting those 860 billion digital assets that we currently have, you can get to those individuals very quickly, and then augment, again, the intelligence, the other human intelligence that you're building within the special operations community to target individuals or target nation states.
Our digital dust is less, dark than theirs, but you need to, and it's in the open realm, but it gets covered by all the other signals, right? Signals are the noise, but what you can do is get ahead of deals. So if there's a critical infrastructure deal that's coming up and you want to mitigate it, there's chatter of it, right? You're there and everywhere, and you know what's about to happen, and as opposed to only being after the fact. So I think getting, not only relying on structured data and after the fact data, but getting to all the before the fact data is critical. And that depends on what type of risk you're looking for, whether it's critical infrastructure or some breach. But getting left of risk is the goal.
So can you go a step further? How do you filter that, and what do you how do you use it?
we integrate it into a knowledge graph, right? And so like if you're investigating an entity, you need to know all of the connections and potential connections they have. You don't necessarily need to kind of, what are your relationship types, right? They're everything from, owned by Chinese state-owned entity for 10 years to about to, enter in a strategic alliance with something, to met at a conference, to, everything in between, right? So you want to mind that from not just kind of, CNN, but like long tail international news, foreign languages, get all the name variations right and put it all together and stuff that's just not practical. And if it's not practical, it's not going to happen without the AI that gets provided. Yeah.
Interesting. So, Dr. Berg, what kinds of blowback do you see from if we were to take all these actions?
Well, I think there have been a few countries that have stated publicly that they disagree with us on the classification of what were previously transnational criminal organizations as now foreign terrorist organizations. A priori, because I think they know that this will increase the pressure on them to act, right? It's one thing to have TCOs operating in your territory, to see it as a law enforcement issue, to regard it as a sovereignty question that these groups challenge state control over certain elements of full territorial sovereignty, but not to have it rise to the level of a foreign terrorist organization. And that increases the urgency, but it also argues, I think, for countries in the region to change, in some cases, their domestic laws when it comes to the way that they address previously TCOs, now FTOs, and some of them are resistant to that. So we've seen resistance in Brazil, we've seen resistance in Mexico to this idea. Second, I think that there are some countries that, I can name the same ones again, Mexico and Brazil, are likely worried about what some of these new tools that we can now unleash in the toolkit will uncover, about the extent particularly of networks that have penetrated, in some cases, the highest offices in the land in various countries. And so I think you're increasing it on the pressure level from a law enforcement issue to a national security issue. You're bringing more tools to bear, and also you're potentially uncovering more of the depths of the networks that we know criminal organizations, now foreign terrorist organizations, are excellent at spinning in Latin American governments. That is worrying. That's a direct threat in many cases to a lot of incumbent political parties, and they simply don't want it. They would rather find an accommodation with these organizations as opposed to fight them head on. And I'll just close by saying this morning, one headline caught my attention when scanning Mexico's news, that Ovidio Guzman has reached a plea agreement and has been removed from his prison in Chicago, presumably to be sent to some unknown location. And the only way, in my mind, that he gets a sweetheart deal where his most likely life sentence is reduced to something in the 20 or 30-year realm would be if he gave up lots and lots and lots of information. And a lot of that is courtesy of new tools that have been brought to bear and new potential increases in sentences and so on, because he's not just a criminal, but now considered to be a terrorist.
So that's a great segue to the next question, but I want to keep, I really like your point on, a lot of these countries are democracies and a lot of the information is open. And so we have a chance to have, OSINT diplomacy. But so in the same foreign policy piece that I mentioned in the beginning, you say that Latin America has 8% of the global population, but a third of the homicides. And what you mentioned about some of the FTOs being, uncovering things that maybe some of these countries don't want to, I would argue that China actually has an easier inroad into those countries because they show up with bags of cash, and we have, 12 months of vetting and Leahy stuff and all that. So how can either the private sector assist in this process, either to help make it quicker, or illuminating shortfalls, or working with the government or partner nations to reduce some of that friction without, pissing everybody off?
Yeah, totally get the question and where you're coming from. I would challenge the notion that the vetting has to be long, though. Like, technology can help us keep morals high and keep standards high and just go a hell of a lot faster, right? And so, like, you look into the fundamental reasons why things have to be long. Some are bureaucratic, some are technological. We can reduce the technological ones collectively down to being very tight. Even, pre-assessing, entities ahead of time and continuously monitoring and just staying on top of it all the time. So there's a trust assessment of everybody you might be partnering with. So of course there are other irreducible pieces that slow you down when it comes to the real world, but for at least the technology component, you can cut months into days.
Yeah, the other thing we can do is really expose the digital infrastructure that's being used by, or that's being used to enable the corruption in these countries and by the criminal organizations. And you can take them down, making it that much harder for those, criminal organizations or those nation states to accomplish those things. You can also expose all the identities, credentials, et cetera, that are being used to accomplish that. It just makes it, it puts up another barrier, another thing that's more difficult for them to accomplish their goals in those countries.
If I can, let me make a general comment about speed of deployment, because this is a huge issue in competition with China. We often hear from our friends in the region, look, the PRC is just faster to put the shovels in the ground. I have to deal with fewer bureaucratic hurdles with you. I'm running for a re-election. I want to make sure that project gets off the ground or that the shovel breaks ground so that I can argue to my people that we're moving in the right direction as manifested by this project. I want to build on something that my colleague Fabiana Pereira said on the last panel, because I think it's a great point. We often do this to ourselves. We fall into this trap of thinking that China is free of any kind of strings and we're the ones who are having to deal with all these strings every time we go to the region. And I think this is a messaging problem more than anything. We haven't found a creative way to do what Fabiana suggested on the previous panel, which is to message the strings that come along with China's engagement in the region. There are strings that come along, but the thing is we don't have a cute, creative, sexy phrase to describe what those strings are. We have tried to call it debt trap diplomacy. That hasn't worked. The reason it hasn't worked, I would argue, is we don't have a good case of debt trap diplomacy the same way we do in South Asia, of China overlending and eventually making what is essentially a vassal state out of a country like Sri Lanka and grabbing a very key piece of infrastructure like the Hambantota port for not just 1, not just 5, not just 20, but 99 years. We don't have a good case like that in Latin America. What we do have is a lot of lost opportunities. Think of a country like Ecuador. Think of the fact that we're now about 4 presidential elections after the guy who's evading the law and seeking asylum in Belgium and took out all the money from the Chinese and has now indebted Ecuador and forced Ecuador to pay off in the form of its national oil production a lot of the money that was taken out. Imagine all the money that would have otherwise been able to be put towards things like security, education, renewable energy, the things that the country is struggling with now. So to all the smart people in the room, if you can come up with a sexy phrase that's not debt trap diplomacy but describes that situation, you will win the competition of being the messaging genius for the Latin American region, because we need that phrase. We need that thing that describes exactly that phenomenon, that the guy in office today is taking the money that you will then have to pay back later, but he doesn't care about the fact that your strategic autonomy will be crimped because it's about him today at this point in time wanting to take out that money for his own purposes. Find me a phrase for that. That's my assignment to all of you very smart people in the room. But that's essentially the problem as I see it. And we need to find a way to message it other than debt trap diplomacy that finds sort of fertile soil in the region as being analytically descriptive of what Latin American countries feel when they get indebted to China.
One other thing that we need to kind of look at down there is kind of time to market, right? When the State Department or DOD has to vet a partner down there to transact with, one of the things that we fall into is the vetting of that partner. OSINT can help kind of vet those partners, just like we do here in the DIB with CMMC. You can assign risk by seeing who those partners are already engaged with using OSINT and assign risks to them, right? Do they have insiders working inside of those organizations? You know, and you can build those risk scores for those vetted partners to be able to, you know, fund those organizations more quickly.
Yeah, I'm in it. And to your point, Dr. Berg, I just think of Winnie the Pooh with his honey pot stuck on his head. I don't have a phrase yet, but maybe we can call it a honey pot.
I've heard that President Xi is very sensitive about Winnie the Pooh metaphors, so maybe we don't want to go there on that one.
Yeah, I'm just spitballing here.
Or maybe we do want to go there. I don't know.
All right. For SpyCloud, for Phil.
Yeah.
You had a recent case where you reduced account takeover in a LATAM region, we'll call it that, by 90% with an e-commerce company with more than 27 million active users. SOCOM is a primary synchronizing organization for counter-threat finance in the DoD and can use this information for intelligence products or to turn around and create influence campaigns with psychological operations. What else can identity intelligence do to either illuminate nefarious financial actions or attribute adversarial actions or efforts in this space?
So from a SIAP perspective, you could go after cartels and do actions that degrade their reputation by exposing them or forcing, making them lose confidence with other organizations, are being able to identify what accounts they're using. You can cause a lot of pain in the time they take to be able to accomplish their goals. Mm-hmm. Those types of things are key in slowing them down. In SOCOM's example is being able to fuse our data with what they're trying to do in building that intelligence around an organization or around a nation and what they're accomplishing or what's going on in that AOR.
Awesome. All right, around the horn, everyone. There are plenty of government representatives in the room, the DoD, SOCOM, some Treasury folks. I saw some CBP on the guest list. What's your message to them?
You start?
Go for it.
Great. My message is the one that I started with, which is that this is a Latin America first administration in my estimation. I think there are two geographic theaters in the world that matter to them. The Indo-Pacific, of course, and the Western Hemisphere. The constellation of individuals in this administration is exactly as I described in my first answer. We've got a number one and a number two at State Department who are both experts in Latin America. If you care about the region and you care about great power competition, now is the time to take advantage of this constellation of individuals in high-level spots that are getting us a lot of attention on the region. In the first 100 days, we had like a half a dozen visits by cabinet members to the region, to various members in various countries in the region. And I would add on top of it all, we have an administration, sometimes for ill, sometimes for good, that is willing to think quite far outside the box. And that's necessary at this point in time when, I would argue, when what we've been doing in previous administrations has not been sufficient to compete with China in the region. So my message is simply carpe diem. Let's take advantage of the moment. Let's keep pressing, and let's pick our battles wisely in areas where we have true comparative advantages.
The Indo-Pacific is, a big area of focus right now for our country, and their influence in the Western Hemisphere is huge. If you look at the materials and the minerals that are currently available, the economic influence that China is having in our hemisphere is huge, and the impact on our economy can be huge. The impact on the drug cartel, as we're seeing in this administration, the focus on it is huge. So knowing who's operating in it, knowing, who's in their networks, how they're doing certain things, how they're transacting in crypto, all those things are important. Use the OSINT to understand that, to augment what you're already doing, and there's a lot of it out there. Like I said, there's, we're closing in on 1 trillion records right now, and by applying that to the work you're already doing, it will, help you get ahead of, in your starting point of where you're trying to go on your investigations.
Yeah, I'll finish more on the OSINT theme as well. And just speaking, for all of industry, it's to the government representatives, like lean in, right? Like be champions. And you're going to have to lean in because the way technology is moving, you have to. It's critical with industry. Not one entity can do things themselves, but more specifically, like lean in and be demanding. There's so many ways you can be like companies like ours want to be demanded things of. For example, being transparent with information. There's new regulation. ICS 206 came out for the intelligence community standards that is starting to allow industry to produce actual OSINT of a form, right? Yes, it's not totally finished. Yes, it'll be used in other pieces, but it's setting standards in a good way that's also future-proof to tell you how to cite AI and cite other things. And so, like, you can demand those things now and move more of the analysis upstream to partners. I know it's a little scary because usually, like traditionally, the analysts are used to having full control, but if you're transparent enough, then that's okay. Also, interoperability, right? You don't want, any Beltway bandit or any company to capture you in general. And so the way to avoid that is setting clear interfaces and interoperable design. So if we compete, you can trade you out pretty easily. We're willing to be traded out and we're willing to compete on terms, not because we have some arbitrary, enterprise hook in you that makes it annoying for bad reasons. So like make the, it's not just competing at the competition stage, it's like continuous competition, right? But that's a design problem. That's designing interoperable interfaces between what the government's doing, what the companies are doing, and making sure it's clean and separable.
Yeah, make sure your partner has open APIs so that you can tie it into your tools. That's very important. And make sure you talk to us. Make sure you share what you need, from industry. That's so important because without your feedback, we're not going to be able to, mold our product to what you need. I can give you a quick example. Last week, we were looking at our data, and one of the law enforcement agencies asked us, can you look at it from an EBT fraud perspective? And we took a look at the data and understood kind of what they were looking for. And now we're participating in a joint task force next week to take down some, people committing fraud in a state. And it was all from that discussion. We tweaked our data and the way we look at it, and it was pretty unbelievable how quickly that happened.
Pretty amazing. We got time for 1 or 2 questions. If you don't have a beer, you're wrong.
So I think at least there's been a few jokes around here about stolen IP, and I think labeling INDOPACOM as one of the focus points is not misaligned, but I think we need to fix our web server for the USPTO's database because all the IP available will be stolen, and if you can prohibit access from China to see the data, then until they play by the rules, maybe that's one way to stop stolen IP. Any thoughts about that? Fixing your web server seems easy.
There's a very fundamental tension between, I'm coming as a former physicist and scientist, right? And so there's a very fundamental tension between open science and research and what you need to close down. So I would draw a very distinct line between public IP, patents, and even applications, because it's pretty much out there, and trade secrets. The trade secrets are what we need to lock down. the inside stuff. And yeah, we can, we have a responsibility to do that in our companies and also help other companies do that too. But we also have to do it in ways that are ethical and moral and tying things back to very plausible IP theft, not just suspected on for bad reasons.
Afternoon. Thank you for doing this. David Rockland, just recently transitioning from the Army over to hopefully the private sector. Very excited about what you guys are doing. In that respect, not completely coordinated with the last question, but curious, what are you seeing as trends in terms of making it maybe more challenging to do OSINT, especially everything from privacy laws, let's say like in Europe, GDPR, or evolving technology, things that spoof and basically make I don't know, everything from personas to, actual what looks like real content and not so real. Thanks.
So we don't scrape any data for our OSINT. Everything's done as a persona in a site. We don't buy any data. The other thing we do is we compare it with data we're getting in other sites. On the privacy laws, because it's reclaimed data and it's already out there, it's open data. It's available, right? We hash data in a lot of cases to protect certain data, but and we narrow kind of if it's a commercial organization like Netflix, right? If you've ever had to reset your Netflix password, that's been because SpyCloud has found that you use the password out there, to protect your account, right? Or something standard, right? It forces a reset in that system. We have legal decisions that come from Cybercom as to how we use our data. That we can share with any agency as well around that.
Yeah, I'd add there are lots of interesting technical solutions, differential private, all sorts of other ways to hash and do technical tricks to help. So that's part of the solution. And we definitely don't want the advertising industrial complex to infect the the intelligence complex that we're trying to support here. But in that context, it's worth pointing out that you still hold guidelines, but there are carve-outs in a lot of the regulations for use cases. For example, with BSA and money laundering, you can do certain things with certain data sets when you have a good reason to, right? Not sell burritos, but to look for money launderers, right? We could it would be a good conversation to widen that, to be like, what other kind of carve-outs could you have? Of course, they're not complete carve-outs, right? You still have to have a baseline of ethics, but that are enforced and not just honor code. But it's worth calling out. That's the way things work, at least in the financial crime world.
But you just have to go quicker. I mean, in the private sector, for example, like I was doing work with the Army OSINT office when Elon Musk was trying to buy Twitter, and now X, and we go, what's that going to do to our collection capability in GDPR in Europe? But some developer figured it out. Throw them a pack of Twizzlers under the door and give them 2 days, and they'll do it. But when the OSINT game started, with computers and technology, we didn't think that we could get behind the Chinese firewall. But if you think that, go check out Wirescreen tomorrow. But there are companies out there that can do things that, you just got to find the niche. But there are technology solutions for just about everything in the OSINT space nowadays.
It's amazing what Mountain Dew and pizza could do for your developers.
All right, we're going to take one more question because this young lady looks determined.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. I just want to mention something really quick about Ecuador. So Ecuador was looking to sign a free trade agreement with the U.S. for 3 years. Last year, they signed with China. Moreover, the president recently promoted constitutional reform So by constitution, the country will allow the establishment of foreign military bases in the country. Based on what Dr. Berg said, if we are changing to a new president with a different vision and more aligned into Venezuela or China, we will have to really think about what battle we are going to choose and what are our priorities in the region. Because if we are putting on the constitutional level the establishment of this type of military bases, that could be used either on the political perspective or, in the common changes that the region is having.
I think that question is probably directed at me. I'll take that one. So on the trade stuff, look, there's not much to say. I've supported trade all of my life. Before moving to CSIS, I worked at a place called the American Enterprise Institute. We like trade. The zeitgeist in the country right now is not pro-trade. And that is up to folks in my position and some others who have a public education function to teach people that trade is actually a good thing and to convince politicians that, in fact, they do have a mandate to extend trade and not a mandate to be only protectionist. So of the value of trade and the need to extend trade to more partners as a tool of U.S. power, among other things, right? I'm already totally convinced of that, and I do hope that the zeitgeist in the U.S. changes rapidly again to become much more open to the idea that the U.S. would increase its number of trade deals as a way of competing with China, as a way of enriching other countries, as a way of building security and economic supply chain security for itself. And in Latin America, the two countries that have been most eager, as you note, are Ecuador and Uruguay. On the bases piece, I agree with you. Under President Noboa, I'm not afraid of a Chinese base popping up in Ecuador. But if we get Rafael Correa's cousin back in Ecuador, if we had a Luis Gonzalez presidency, or if we have something else in the future, who knows, the strategic environment may well change. But I would argue that that's all the more reason to ensure that if the Ecuadorians are keen on us being there, that we're there. And in particular, that we're back in Manta, doing what we did previously in Manta, and that position could provide us a way of boxing out any kind of future bases under a future strategically changed context where an adversary like China would be able to get a chance at something equivalent.
Well, I know it's not a competition, but we just ended our panel in 49 minutes, and we have 45 seconds to go. So that's it, everyone. Go grab a beer.
We're giving people 45 seconds extra to go grab their beer.
Yeah.